record button. Cool. So, hi, everybody.
Hi.
It doesn't feel like it was a short week, not at all. So many things have happened, and this is Paige's last day, I believe. So I gave her a final assignment, which was to kick off our getting to know you. And Ryan, do you want me to manage that or show it, or would you like to run it? But
I can run it when we get there.
all
Maybe
together.
that's easiest.
Okay, and I think we're waiting for Stacy still, because I have a question that involves Stacy, but we can start with Paige's question. You want to give us an order, Paige?
Yeah, I'm trying to type it in. Give me 1 second.
Okay.
Oh, is that everyone? No. Okay, so my question is, what do you most associate with summer? And this can be anything. For me, I figured I'd go first to give you a second to think. I associate honeysuckle, like the plant and also the smell, with summer, because as a kid, I always did swim team and the pool was surrounded by it. So afterwards, we would just like suck on honeysuckle while we waited to get picked up. So to me, that is like the essence of summer.
All right, for me, let's see, with the summer, I associate it definitely with pools, and I associate it with childcare.
So I was hoping you would make a longer answer, Chris, to give me more time to think, but so from my childhood, I associated with camping. We did not have a lot of money, and so my parents would drive an absolute death march. Like, we would drive from Southern California to Crater Lake in one day, and then we would camp in the cheapest campground. So that meant, flush toilets were not part of the landscape at all. Sometimes no toilets. And yeah, so it was like the cheapest vacation, and they were of the generation that just let your children play, which I think is kind of awesome. And we would just kind of go. But that was our vacation. We'd go camping and like not take a shower for like a month.
So similarly, I associate summer with backpacking, and but it's not cheap. I spend way more on backpacking than I would on a hotel. And I don't normally do the backpacking trips that I had hoped I would do. I have 3 planned this summer, and I'll probably go on 1 or 2.
Yeah, I think for me it's gardening, and which I'm starting to realize can be a very expensive hobby. So yes.
I was about to give an answer for the last couple of years, and then when Tammy brought up, childhood experiences, I was thinking back over this last 30 seconds that different stages of my life, summer was different, the months were different, the place was different, and I have different associations throughout my entire life. But I won't bore you with them. My most recent one is just going to the beach. You live 15 minutes from the beach, it's the only time to go and swim. And so, yeah, that's what I associate with.
I think I associate summer with locusts, just because I grew up in Texas, so they would kind of come down in swarms and you just heard them all the time. And then as I was an adult and would work in field work, primarily in the summer, often in the South or the Midwest, it would just be kind of fields of locusts jumping out in front of you as you tromp around. So just always think of them for summer.
For me, I suppose at this stage of my life, it's mostly children and being with my kids more, and we take lots of there's so much to do out west, so we take lots of little trips. I mean, I'm sitting in a bed now because we're in a hotel right now. So we take lots of little sort of working trips with the kids. And so I think I associate it with getting in the car and packing things up and this kind of ebb and flow with my children's way of interacting with each other, where it's bickering turns back to friendship to back to bickering. And it's this kind of constant cycle, but it's kind of neat when you step back and observe it, I suppose.
Yeah, I think both my parents were teachers, so they never worked in the summer. And so for me, it's just like having time with my parents is totally what I still associate with summer, even now. So maybe Maren will be the same, obviously. So
Looks that way. Hey, and Stacy just joined, so you may have to give her the prompt again because she might not be able to see.
Yeah, so the prompt is, what do you most associate with summer?
What do I
Yeah.
most associate with summer?
Yeah.
Interesting question.
Hmm.
I mean, is it my turn? Am I cutting in already?
You came at the end.
Okay, sorry about that. Well, what I most associate with summer now is sailing on Thursday nights, followed by hot dogs or brats, all summer long. That is the most associated.
It sounds like fun.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, everyone. Thanks to everyone who's able to attend Paige's farewell. For those of you who could not attend, this will be Paige's farewell. Thank you, Paige, for being a part of our group. And yeah, some of us survived tenure track, so I guess you might too. So a couple of things that I didn't put on the agenda that I want to raise, and I want to keep them short to leave time for Ryan and Chris. The first is there was some chat in the email about our topic for next week, which was a follow-up on what we talked about last week and the what Adam presented. He presented basically the participatory systems mapping. And then I think there was a move toward like, how are we going to implement it in the project? There was also a sense that that could take a long time and could need a smaller group. I had hoped that I could say a few words about how I saw it fitting into the project when I wrote the proposal, which doesn't mean that it's gospel. It just means that that was a thought. And so I wanted to do that for with the whole group. And so there's a little bit of chicken and egg there, but I was thinking that maybe we could use the meeting to have, and I would say a few words for like 5 or 10 minutes about how I had seen it working, what I thought the questions were. And then we could go into talking about how it might work in the project. And if people wanted to winnow that down to a smaller group, we could set the meeting to take a little bit longer, and that way we wouldn't have to schedule one again. We could just, and so then people could drop off if they felt they weren't particularly relevant or didn't want to be in the details. But we could say book out an hour and a half so that we would be together at first, and then people could back out if they did not feel like they wanted to continue further. So what do y'all think of that? Okay, cool. So I'll do that. I don't have the okay from Ellison, but I'll just inform her. That's what we talked about. Okay. Thanks. And then the other thing is Stacy and I have been meeting offline about the composition and requests of the advisory board. And what we believe is happening is that the semi-structured interview script is approved and kind of ready to go forward. And so that's number one. And number two, we also think that it's still okay to get feedback from like high level stakeholders on it, not to change it, right? Not to go in a different direction, Chris, but to just to hear what they have to say about that direction. And we also think that it would be, we struggled a bit with what are we going to ask the advisory board? and then telling the advisory board what they're doing. And it seems like we just need to get something concrete out there. And so this could be a point of bringing forward, let's have a meeting with the stakeholders to, or with some of the people who could be on the advisory board to get their feedback on this approach. And that would be a way to bring people together. So just wanted to float that to the whole group and see if there were any strong reactions in one direction or the other.
And were you guys thinking that we should do that before the interviews start?
Yes.
Or, okay.
Well, I guess it depends. So what I don't want to do is hold up the interviews, because the process of gathering, when were you planning to start the interviews, Chris?
Well, I can whenever. Ryan and I will work on and he'll kind of talk about this process, I'm sure, today. But once we come up with a target list of numbers or email addresses, then really at any point I can begin doing that. So I will, but I'm also comfortable waiting until you're, ready, until we've had a chance to talk to that board.
So it seems like it would be ideal to have some feedback for you, but knowing how difficult it's been to schedule, that's the thing I'm concerned about. Right. I don't want it to be like, well, we couldn't get a meeting till October, so so please don't start. Stacy, do you have more to say about this, or what would be the ideal?
Yeah. So by having the chance to put the interview questions or kind of interview protocol in front of like an external group, maybe they're not actual board members, but by, folks that are gathered for feedback, may be able to contribute to, maybe asking questions in a different way, or adding to your, adding some richness that maybe wasn't there before in terms of the conversations that you might be having with some of the groups. It might also be helpful to ask some folks, like, and again, I haven't seen, I don't know what the protocol is, but it may be helpful to get some feedback on the protocol early on, to say, like, how does this question land? Is this going to work well? Are people going to respond? That the stakeholders know, is it going to be a favorable response? Anyway, long story short, I think that this was a great opportunity to hear from others. I don't know if you've done that before. Like, have you put the questions in front of anyone outside of like this group so far? Have you asked colleagues or friends or others on their opinions on how the survey tool would be used in land?
Yeah, so far, this group is the only group that has had access to the questions, but it's also been approved by the IRB. So which is obviously less concerned with the topic itself, and just more concerned with, is it protective? So no, outside of this group, no one has discussed the substance.
Yeah, so I think that this is a good opportunity to kind of do that and make any early changes, avoiding some like lessons learned and throwing away interviews early on. I'd also just like to say that, like, this isn't like just some other board, like this will be like, these are stakeholders for everybody's project. So they're yours, whatever feedback that you get, it's folks that you're inviting in to this project to provide feedback and analysis on some of the tools that are going to be used in the field as part of the research. I see your question, Narisma. I don't have a good answer for that right now. We've engaged a few people a few months ago at this point, and we haven't re-engaged them because it was difficult getting a meeting together with the group, and also difficult in identifying exactly what the substance of that meeting would be, with a set of documents, with a proposal, with something for people to look at and respond to. It should be, it's easier for me to build an agenda around something like that, where there is a tangible product that we're asking people to take a look at and respond to. So I would love to have the opportunity to use that, and invite people to a meeting at a timeline, or within a timeline that works for the team, to ask for feedback and see how that goes. And of course, I'd like the researchers who worked on this and are going to be presenting these questions through the interview processes actually present at this meeting to present about the project and what the work so far has entailed, and to describe the survey tool or other tools that you're using for the project for feedback.
Yeah, so I think a struggle that I've had is let's see, a couple of things. Stacy sent out seeking engagement in the board, and received some responses that were, I felt, from groups that were interested, but they had a certain flavor, like they weren't as grassroots as I had been hoping. And grassroots is a very loose term here. And so then we started asking the question, how do we engage other people? And it was hard to get responses. And so there's a little bit of like, if you tell people they're on an advisory board for a giant sprawling project, then that is hard for them to grasp onto. And so that's why I shared that document of what are the kinds of questions we might be asking and who would we be asking them of. And maybe we really don't have an advisory board, but we have a set of feedback mechanisms. And so, yes, there has been a paragraph written, and I think it went out with the original request, and it came out of our letter of abstraction exercise that we did back in the fall. But it may have been not targeted enough for people to grab onto, like what questions you could actually be doing. And so I do think we need to put some time into communication as well.
It just seems a little like a chicken and egg, like you said, because people's motivation to give feedback and also our objective would be compromised if we already start the interviews.
Yeah, I know. So
But we don't want to delay it too long too, and it seems to be a very early stages.
right.
Sure what to do.
Right. I think we just need to get something moved forward and get it rolling and create an engagement opportunity around the survey, and do it in a timeline where it doesn't really hang up Ryan and Chris. And I would like to give Ryan and Chris time to talk about what they're doing, because this is also relevant for us to provide feedback on that. So I guess the short answer is, I think we're going to move forward with trying to get enough communication to describe what we might be seeking with the interviews, rather than trying to give a whole sense of the entire project and how it fits together. I think we're going to try to winnow it down and just make a step forward.
That makes sense. And is it possible to do like a few pilot interviews? Maybe, not the main sample we're really concerned with, just to iron things out. And then it gives you buy a little time.
So would that be better answered if we let you present what you're going to present today, and then we can maybe think about how the stakeholder feedback would fit into it. Would that be helpful? Yeah, let's do that, because I feel like I have a speculative idea of what y'all are actually doing, and then I'm speculating about how we could play into it. So let's get yeah, go ahead and share what you're going to share.
Chris, do you want me to share mine first, or do you want to go first?
No, go for it. I can,
right.
I'll just talk more about the questions we're going to ask.
And then so I'm going to, sorry, I muted myself in the middle of talking. I'm going to talk about selection then. So I shared the slides, but Tammy, can I share my screen as well? Oh,
You can share you should be able to share your screen.
All right, here we go. So you should be able to see my slides there as well. And I'm hoping that since this is recorded, that, hopefully ask lots of questions and critique as you can, because that's one of the things I would love, is to generate feedback on, does this make sense? And how I frame this is in terms of like, we need to find houses that are actually making changes. And this goes back to the conversation we had, I believe, 2 weeks ago, about like, how do we know who is actually doing this? And so what I wanted to talk about is how we could use permits and property data to at least get a rough idea of how this might work and who we should be talking to. So I want to use 2 homes as a case. So these are homes, both of them made a change to their HVAC systems in 2022. So the first home is this home here, built, I believe, 1904. Second home might be Chris's neighbors in Pueblo West. Sorry, built a little later. Now, the interesting thing about, if we look at these homes just generally, we actually know a ton about people's homes. We probably actually know too much about homes to be useful. So I put 2 links there that you can go to the county property record page, and you can pull all of the data on each of these homes. How many bedrooms do they have? How many bathrooms do they have? And most of us actually already know this data exists, because I doubt there's anybody in here who hasn't been to Zillow, for example, or Redfin. All Zillow and Redfin are really doing is using existing public data, putting it in an area that's actually easy to view, so that they can then say, hey, this is what we think these homes are worth. So the first home that I had there, Zillow has their estimate of 150,000. Again, that's just based on general property characteristics. Second home, a little bit different. So Zillow says this home in Pueblo West worth about 500,000. Now, I think there's actually a little bit of a challenge here of how do we use property data to actually inform our question of like, which of these houses should we actually go out and talk to? Even like, if we don't think about this of like, we don't know who made changes, property records themselves are kind of they're a little bit of a challenging data source, because we know a lot, but we don't always know how accurate that data is. So things like homeowners' names and addresses and property values are actually probably pretty accurate, because counties use all of that property information in order to say, hey, we are going to give you X dollars of taxes and you have to pay us. Also, there are some things that like don't change very much. So if your house was built of bricks in 1905, it's probably still built of bricks. Your original foundation type is probably still your foundation type. Property size is one of those things that counties track, because they tax you based on your property size. Usually, you know when the house was built, how many bedrooms it has, bathrooms, size. In Colorado, we actually can know how do people vote, because that's all public record. So if you want something like that, are they Democrat, Republican, Independent? It's actually very accurate, because people have to register to vote. But then there are some things that aren't very accurate. So when was the house remodeled? Counties collect information on that, but if you look at it, it's usually wrong. What are the existing heating and cooling appliances? Looking at the property record data is pretty spotty, whether it's correct or not. Looking around Pueblo, there's like tons of gravity powered furnaces still. So those are the old furnaces that like you put coal in the bottom of your house and they just use gravity to rise the heat up. I don't think there's probably that many of those left in Pueblo, but looking at the property data, you would guess there's a lot. So probably not that accurate. Then there are some things that like we would be really interested in them, but they don't show up in property records. There's really no record of whether homes are insulated or not, what the quality of the electrical panel is. Does it have an efficient HVAC system versus just an HVAC system? How well does the HVAC system function, and what is like the fuel type? Things like that just don't show up very well. So I think they're a useful data source. There's potentially limits and risks of using property characteristics. I think why I put this slide in there is I wanted to acknowledge, I think, a tension here in the selection process of we'd be selecting houses for interview based on housing characteristics. And we're actually more interested in people. So this is a little bit of a leap because we're going to be able to say, hey, we know this house was built in 1906. Maybe we know who the homeowner is, but we're not going to actually know a lot of characteristics of those homeowners. And so that's a risk. And it's actually, I think, an interesting question and one I'm excited to engage with is, are these structural characteristics useful for identifying people of interest for a sample? That was just a diagram of how I was thinking about this. So we need to model decisions to change the home based on previous or on these observable characteristics. Now, I think this would be really difficult if it weren't for the existence of permits. I see permits as really, really helpful. And this is what we talked about a few weeks ago. And so I wanted to go back into these two cases and talk about why I think permits can help us to understand changes better. So let's say hypothetically you own the house to the right. So built 1905, you have a gravity furnace and an evaporative cooler. I want you to think for yourself for a second. If you wanted to put in a new central heat pump or a mini split system, what permits would you need? Say you have a gravity furnace, evaporative cooler, what permits would you need to put in a central heat pump or a mini split system? So two technologies that people are excited about. I'm going to let you think whenever anybody's ready to guess. I'm going to open the floor. That way I don't have to call on someone. What permits might you go to Pueblo County to get?
I have a couple of guesses.
You go for it.
Well, you need an environmental permit if you're getting rid of coal, disposing of stuff associated with that. Maybe there's going to be structural changes you're making if you don't have a duct system. There's a central heat pump, so maybe that would require a building permit, building modification permit. I don't know what they're called. You may need an upgrade to your electricals if you're going to have such a high load, and so you may need to get an electrical permit for that.
I think you hit all the main ones and added one that we can't get a record of. So the environmental permits, at least in Colorado, that's like, you might go to hazardous waste, but usually the contractors are going to do that. And I've never seen a permit for that, but the other ones you totally would need. Probably need an electrical permit because you probably need to add a 220 outlet somewhere. You need a mechanical permit. You actually might need multiple mechanical permits because you might need one for doing sheet metal to add the proper type of ducting. And then you might also need one to install the actual system. Now, if we change the situation, the permitting should actually change as well. So a second case might be, let's say we have a gravity furnace and an evaporative cooler. That is what this house had prior to 2022. Let's say we wanted to install a new furnace and replace the evaporative cooler. So not putting in a heat pump. How might that change the permits? Any ideas?
If it's a trick question, then you have to get all the same permits.
Potentially, but maybe not.
Not the electrical.
Yeah, probably not electrical. And I think this is part of the interesting thing that we could tease out here is depending on what permits people file, we actually might be able to approximate what changes people are making to their homes in ways that aren't going to show up in those general property records. So I want to show you what this actually looks like in the case of actually both of these houses. Case one, you probably need a mechanical permit, an electrical permit because you need to install 220, and then maybe a mechanical permit for sheet metal. Looking through permits, sometimes contractors will file the ducting permit with the new AC permit or new furnace permit as well. So it could show up as one or two permits. In the second case, there actually would be two permits as well. So you would permit the furnace, and then usually they end up permitting the evaporative cooler separately. Weird nuance there is if they're doing an evaporative cooler, there's always this second permit where it seems like furnace and AC changes, they'll do all at once on one permit. So why that is, I probably need to call the permitting person and be like, what's up with this? So looking at the actual data, what do we see here? So this is a screenshot from the city or from the Pueblo Building Department website. So this is for that first home at 2219 Route Avenue. What we have here is 2 permits, 3 months apart. So in June of 2022, their contractor filled out the link above to the contractor to say, hey, they're going to replace and put in, or sorry, it's a 004 mechanical new permit. And then they wrote replace AC. Administrative data is really fun because it's almost always like kind of wrong. So in this case, they actually replaced the AC. I think they checked the wrong, or the evaporative cooler. They checked the wrong blocks. It should have been a 004R permit, but they permitted it as a new install. And so this is for doing the evaporative cooler. Then in September, they actually went in and replaced the furnace. If you look at this permit, what you get for this is you have who is the owner, who is the contractor who actually did it, a phone contact, a permit number, and then you can actually go in and get a little bit more details. Now, this is a little bit of an unfortunate part of Pueblo. If you were to look at these in Denver, the notes are actually really well filled in. In Pueblo, they're pretty spotty. And so what we'd actually see here is, hey, when did it happen? And then information from the inspector. So for that first permit, the reason I know that it was an evaporative cooler is the inspector left this note M22 that's an evaporative cooler. So inspectors leave a code saying, what is it I inspected at this location? The furnace, we know it's a furnace because inspector said, hey, furnace here, and there was this furnace code as well. So it's not a ton of information. I think to me, part of the challenge has been, how do we figure out exactly what people are doing based on like a few lines of text? At this point, I've mostly been doing like regular expressions of text search, of looking at a lot of these and figuring out, all right, what are the words that generally go with some sorts of permits? And then the idea was be like, oh, we think pretty high confidence this person did a heat pump. We think this person did an evaporative cooler. I think based on the amount of information here, you're probably never going to be 100% certain. I think there's also potential, like as we begin to pick out cases, to say, hey, this is a potentially interesting story of, we had a company go out and change an evaporative cooler in June, then they went out in September and changed the furnace. Well, why did the homeowner do it in that order? Why didn't they do it all at once? I think we could each of us make up a story for why that happened. Like maybe the contractor went out and did the evaporative cooler and was like, hey, you need to do your furnace. Maybe it was, hey, it's cooling season now, we'll wait till heating season to do the other sorts of thing, the other version of that. I think both of those are stories we'd be interested in. And so even though there's not a lot of information here, I think it's useful as far as thinking, well, this is a potentially interesting case of how do people time things? How do they align things? What is it that drives their decision? So the other house I picked out at the beginning actually installed a heat pump in 2022. And I want to show you what this looks like as well, because I think it's another example of how permits are potentially useful, but also risky. And in this case, the permit was actually wrong. So while Tammy said at the beginning, she probably would have filed the wrong permits because she wouldn't know, this is actually something you see occurring in these permits. So these people got a mini split system put into their house. And if you look at the inspector comments, in addition to being really mad that nobody was home, one of the comments from the inspector is they never permitted the electrical. So if you go out and you look at the HVAC permit, there's never another electrical permit to go with it. And the permit was never actually finished. So they filed the permit, they got an inspector out there, but it's actually never been re-inspected. So in this case, the HVAC install is actually, it's non-compliant, which is probably not an immediate issue for the homeowner. It's an issue if they need to sell, of they'd probably actually need to finish the permit and make sure it was up to code if the person there and wanted to install do this. Looking through permits, I think one of my initial ideas was, oh, we could use electrical permits to figure out who's actually doing major changeovers, because we could link up electrical permits and HVAC permits and saying, well, this is a major change. The unfortunate part I've ran into is what you're seeing here is what's the most common thing of, it seems oftentimes contractors file one permit and not the other. And so I think actually the better way to get at that is going to be to look at these inspector comments and see what inspectors are commenting on in those permits, so we can tease out exactly what they're doing. All right, I'm almost done talking, I promise. So what are the major things I think we should sample on? I think we should focus on people who changed HVAC in 2021 and 2022. That gives us, and we can add 2023 as well if we want. That gives us a sample of about 2,000 potential homes that we know filed permits in that period. I think one of the questions I have is, what do we want to focus on there? Do we really want to focus on people who did heat pumps, people with ACs, or like, is it okay to actually sample people who only changed their furnace and talk with them about why they did that, what went into that decision? I would like to do a mix of both new and replacement installs, because I think those introduce different questions. Like, what is it that causes someone to look at their house and say, we need a completely new system versus we're going to modify our existing system? Mix of probable fuel sources. So to me, like, given the heating characteristics of Colorado, I don't think it makes sense to say we're only going to look at people who electrify, because like that's going to be a tiny number. I think when I looked at 2022, there's like 10 potential homes that did heat pumps. It's not a lot of that 1,000. And so like, I think there's actually some value to saying like, hey, we could actually look at people who had maybe electric baseboard heating and like, they made a change. What did they do instead? Or, they have gas furnace. Maybe they put in a different gas furnace or did something else along the way. One thing I'm working on that I haven't finished is I want to be able to identify houses with the lowest probability of change and highest probability of change. So if we take all of the houses in Pueblo, for example, and we say, well, who actually filed permits? There's going to be some houses that we'd be shocked they filed a permit just based on statistics. And to me, those would be interesting houses to go talk to, because we wouldn't have expected them to make the change they did. And then finally, I want to add homeowner characteristics in. We can't do a lot here because we don't have a lot of homeowner characteristics. What we generally have is the owner address the same as the parcel address? So does somebody get their mail essentially at the place they own, or do they have it sent elsewhere? The idea is if the owner address is not the parcel address, they're probably renters. And so you could also use that to sample renters. Probable race and ethnicity. This is something that I talked with a smaller group here about, actually imputing race and ethnicity based on who the homeowner is, and ownership last name. And then ownership length. So since these are property records, we can see how long have people been in their house. Are they longtime homeowners or are they relatively new homeowners? Okay. Questions, concerns. So that was my spiel of what I've been up to. Yeah.
Ryan, can you leave it at your previous slide? Can you explain, Ryan, you think you have a sense for how to a priori assess the probability or likelihood of change? That's the one I wasn't sure how you're going to know.
I was going to essentially try and do propensity scores for filing a permit.
Okay.
That's a bit
So you
easiest
use
way
the
to
public
describe it.
record data and you try to run it.
Yep.
Okay.
So the way I'm planning to do it right now is like, if we take every one of our permits and find like nearest neighbors, essentially, like who is it that like, we wouldn't have expected them to file a permit, but they did. So, yeah.
But so can you explain something about propensity scores? Because I don't know what that is.
Yeah, the idea is propensity score is like propensity to adopt or propensity to like participate in a program or something like that. So the idea would be to like create a match for each home that has a permit that like is equal in other observables. So we could try and essentially say like, so we could try and tease out like what characteristics of homes go with applying for permits. But it would really just be like that permit application versus not application. Does that help? I didn't feel like I explained it very well.
So the idea there, Ryan, we'd want to sample homes for interviews that have a high probability of filing for a permit. And we can also identify those that seem to be, at risk, for lack of a better term, have a high probability of filing for a permit, but according to our records, they have not filed for a permit. Is that correct?
Well,
I was thinking of it as there are some homes, for example, that like maybe based on their neighborhood characteristics or the age of the home or who we think lives there or the value of the home, we might actually be surprised that they would make the change they did. So like that first home, for example, the home is worth, Zillow said it's worth 150,000. It would be pretty surprising if we saw them file a permit to get a heat pump put in that's going to be $30,000 maybe, because their HVAC is going to be a large proportion of their home value. So the idea would be to figure out what we would expect based on home characteristics to observe. And then when we see like things with high residuals, oh, we wouldn't have expected, we actually sample those people as well, to try and capture more variance in what's happening.
I like your selection criteria. I really think it makes sense. The one thing I'm thinking is that if you were to try and get variation on all these, your sample size is going to grow more than 30, right?
Yeah, but I think we have to have a large sample size because I don't know what the uptake rate is going to be. Interviews are hard, and so like, I don't know, Chris, you might be able to answer that more than me, but like from my perspective, like I was thinking we needed to have like hundreds of homes that we would potentially want to talk to get 30 people who we could actually talk to.
But then
Yeah.
you might not get the variation in all of these. You could risk getting some kind of selection bias.
No, I think that remains true. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I would be hesitant to import the language of quantitative research to qualitative research, but for the survey that Ellison and I did last year, we did some things. We were trying to target homeowners specifically, and two issues that have come up in the review process for some of our papers, which, by the way, the papers didn't get rejected. It was just reviewers asking and sort of critiquing, was questions of representativeness. So I think we need to have a good account for why homes were chosen, why, and that the purpose is not necessarily to come up with a representative sample of Pueblo. That we're interested in people that are homeowners or that have active decision-making ability. That's been a little bit more, it might be a little more challenging with a survey too than it will be for qualitative research. We may not run into that critique, but it's something to, I think, get ahead of a little bit. And then also I think we'll get questions about why this particular city and why it's interesting and why it's important, that we should at least be thinking about. Not saying that we have to have a great answer now, but I suspect that both of those things will come up. Representativeness questions, and also why was this particular place chosen as a we basically need a few sentences that say this is why Pueblo is just the perfect place to do this kind of research, and no other place compares, or something like that. My other, so would the logic be that we are going to assign a series of probabilities or propensity scores to a sample of homes, and some of those have been homes that have made changes that we know about or probably have based upon permits, some have not, is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And then so it's interesting questions too about how we want to sample, right? Because this could be divided into strata and things like that, but that also might be a little bit too quantitative the way I'm thinking of it. You may get to a point where you've got 25 homes that look really similar based upon the propensity scores, and we're thinking, well, we don't have any of these low propensity homes, so we've got to hard to do some target sampling and things like that. Just things that might come up, but I do like the idea of we figured out the probability that a permit would be filed for a home, and we use that as a basis of trying to come up with a sample rather than convenience methods or word of mouth or things like that. It sounds like we did our homework a little better, I think, if we can describe that. It'd be nice also if there was it makes sense to me, your logic, but it'd be nice also if there was a citation for somebody else is in a similar situation trying to conduct qualitative research, but they use this quantitative information to develop a model that in this very general sense captures a lot of information about these households. The other thing is we might
Adam,
we might be able to get race.
hello. I really want to leave time for Chris to present.
Oh, so I'm sorry.
So, but I can see that there's a lot more.
Yeah, I'll put it up.
Points. So Yeah, I don't want to cut off the discussion. As usual, we have more to talk about than fits in the hour, and but I want to make sure Chris gets his ideas out there, and maybe there's a follow-up meeting needed, and we're running into more discussion than we can actually fit in our weekly meetings, and so we're gonna maybe have to do some small groups throughout the week, but I think it's a good opportunity to move it forward. Anyway, Chris, can we have Chris present and then?
Yeah, I will say that if the possibility of moving the interviews down a little bit in terms of the date is if that might happen, I'm more than happy to do the presentation, in a couple weeks as opposed to now. I'm not going to be able to obviously get through much, but I was just going to talk more about our goal, which is to capture well-being and the drivers of that socio-technical change. We're going to be using semi-structured interviews, meaning that everyone's going to have some common baseline questions, but depending on how they respond to those questions, we will be asking, or I will be asking, more specific questions that are a little more tailored to their previous responses. So we're going to be learning a little bit more about their residential history and questions like how long they've lived in the residence, whether they share the residence, how long they've lived in the community. We'll ask questions about their previous residence, how the current one in certain ways compares to the previous one. And I'm just kind of going through this a little bit fast. If I need to take up another time slot later on, I can. As far as the change goes, to better understand, again, we're kind of assuming from the get-go that they have made these changes, or that they are more likely to down the road. But we're going to ask them questions about their experience with that change. So at a basic level, that means, whether those experiences were positive or negative. We're going to look at how they frame those experiences, how they interpret them, how they portray them. Do they, for instance, when they're talking about their experience, do they focus on the period at which the installation was occurring? Do they focus on more or less the aftermath, the post-installation period? We want to know about what brought on the change. For instance, was there an end of life or some other disruption? Were there other triggering factors? And certainly those would be areas where the semi-structured approach will be useful, because those responses will likely vary to some extent. We're going to be looking at whether other people were involved in the decision-making process, what role they played. Was each decision maker who had a voice, were they supportive? Was anybody opposed? What were any potential reservations? What did they center around? We want to learn more about how they learned about the environmental upgrade. What was their informational source? We'll be looking at the decision-making process. When was it made? How they, or who they reached out to first? How did they know to reach out to that party? Or on the other hand, were they introduced to this possibility? Who introduced it? What did they learn from that interaction? As far as any kind of barriers or obstacles, did they experience any of those while they were trying to make the change? Were they satisfied with the change? Was it, is the change reliable compared to what they've had before? How does it, more or less match up with what they had previously? Let's see. And then I'm running out of time here. So then there's a separate subset of questions that are much more tailored to the idea of well-being, and then with the goal of obviously connecting that idea of well-being with the changes that were made. So again, I can talk a little bit more on that during another session if necessary.
Yeah, it seems like we could have a quite long discussion on this as well. So maybe it was my bad to squeeze you both into the same session.
Yeah, I mean, it would be good to discuss this more. It sounds really good, though. Sounds really good. Can I have one question, Tammy? Or do you want to just have a Q&A some other time?
No, of course, I want Chris to get feedback, so I'm looking now at the schedule and see how to shuffle things to open up some space for this, for both discussions. Please, have a question.
So Chris, yeah, that sounds great. I was wondering if they don't have a heat pump, they haven't installed a heat pump, and we could ask them, did they consider it? So they say the reasons why they did what they did. It would be interesting to include consistently the consideration of the heat pump, is it in their radar, on radar screen at all or not?
Mhm.
Okay, I'm just going to make a note of that real quick. No, that's a good point. So asking about alternatives that they could have pursued and why they might have not gone with those alternatives. Is that right?
Exactly. That's the more general point. Exactly.
Okay.
But Chris, I really liked your focus on identifying when the decision was perceived, that the whole time component that I think we usually miss in decision making, right? And yeah. Okay, well, I am going to shuffle the agenda, which means I'm maybe talking to some of you. It seems like I need to do some offline work on aligning when the feedback from the advisory group could come in, because it may be, if we could bring those all together, that might be a time to really focus on the survey. But I think there's a lot to unpack there. Yeah, so Chris, you totally deserve a whole session now that you're ready to go forward. Does anyone have any final comments? All right, well, thank you all for turning up. Have a great weekend, and I will be in touch with you. And thanks, Paige, for being a part of the group, and we hope to hear great things from you.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I'll be in touch.
Good luck.
Thanks.
Bye, Paige.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.